The studio lights at NBC's Burbank complex ran at exactly 5,600 Kelvin. That is the temperature that makes skin look alive on camera. On the evening of March 14, 1979, those lights were aimed at a stage that held 12 folding chairs arranged in 2 rows, a moderator's desk pushed slightly left of center, and a man who had not lost a public confrontation in 11 years. His name was Raymond Tobias Farrell. He was 31 years old. He stood 6 feet 2 inches and weighed 219 pounds without the gi. He had won the All-American Open 3 consecutive years. He had trained under Masoyama for 14 months in Japan. He had broken 4 concrete blocks with a single palm strike at a demonstration in San Jose in 1977. In front of a panel of judges who certified the count, he had appeared on the cover of Black Belt magazine twice, the second time with a headline that read "The Future of American Karate." He was not a man who talked about what he could do. He was a man who had already done it, repeatedly, in front of people who kept records. In the next 14 seconds, he would say 4 words to Chuck Norris on a live national broadcast that would be repeated in dojos from San Diego to Glasgow for the next 46 years. Nobody in that studio, not the floor director, not the boom operator, not the 112 members of the live audience, arranged in a shallow arc behind the camera line, knew that they were about to watch the last public mistake Raymond Farrell would ever make. The show was called American Fighters. It had been running for 2 seasons on late-night NBC, a 30-minute conversation format that brought martial arts practitioners in front of a mainstream audience at a time when most Americans still confused karate with magic tricks. The host was a former wrestling journalist named Don Hapscom, who wore a brown sport coat and asked questions with the careful politeness of a man who did not entirely understand the answers. The premise was simple: 2 martial artists, 1 conversation, moderated debate about philosophy, technique, and the state of American fighting sports. The producers had not expected conflict. They had booked the episode as a collegial exchange between 2 prominent figures who, on paper, occupied adjacent lanes. Both were known. Both were accomplished. Both had trained seriously and competed publicly. What the producers had not accounted for was that Raymond Farrell had read a magazine article 4 weeks earlier in which Chuck Norris had been described, in a single subordinate clause, as the most technically complete American martial artist of his generation. Farrell had read that clause 3 times. He had folded the magazine in half and set it on his kitchen counter. He had left it there for a week. The resentment that grew in that week was the particular kind that lives in capable men who have never received the recognition they believe the record entitles them to. It was not irrational. Farrell's record was genuinely distinguished. The problem was that he had begun, slowly, to confuse the record with the man. To believe that what was written in a column represented the full accounting of what a man could do in actual space, under actual pressure, against an actual opponent who was also trying to win. That confusion, carried into a television studio, would cost him something he could not retrieve. Chuck Norris arrived at the NBC lot at 4:17 in the afternoon, 2 hours and 43 minutes before taping. He arrived in a gray Ford pickup truck. He was wearing a white collared shirt, dark slacks, and shoes that a wardrobe assistant later described as the kind of shoes a hardware store manager would wear on a Tuesday. He shook hands with the floor director. He asked where the coffee was. He found it and poured himself a cup, and stood near the craft services table reading a folded piece of paper that nobody asked about. He was 39 years old. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed 174 pounds at his last recorded weight. He had not competed professionally since 1974. His hair had begun its slow withdrawal. He did not carry himself like a man who expected to be watched. If you had placed Raymond Farrell and Chuck Norris in the same frame during those early hours, and asked someone who had never seen either of them to identify which one was the martial arts legend, they would not have chosen the man near the coffee machine. That was the first miscalculation of the evening. The taping began at 7 o'clock. Don Hapscom opened with his standard introduction, reading from a card that listed credentials in the respectful and slightly breathless tone that late-night hosts use when they want the audience to understand that the guests matter without explaining exactly why. He introduced Farrell first. He read the titles, he read the years, he named the magazine covers. The audience applauded with the enthusiasm of people who had been told by a warm-up comedian to applaud with enthusiasm. He then introduced Chuck Norris. He read the titles in the same tone. He named the films and the tournament record. The audience applauded again. Farrell sat in the chair on the left. He had his hands on his knees. He was very still. He was the stillness of a man who is waiting for something specific, not the stillness of a man who is at rest. The conversation ran for 19 minutes without incident. Hapscom asked about training philosophy. He asked about the relationship between sport karate and practical combat. He asked about the future of the martial arts in mainstream American culture. Both men answered carefully. Norris spoke in short declarative sentences. He did not elaborate beyond what the question required. He deferred twice when Farrell cited specific competition results. He said both times that he had not seen those matches. It was at 19 minutes and 43 seconds into the recording that Hapscom made an error of the kind that television hosts make when they believe the conversation needs energy. He turned to the audience and said, with a broad gesture toward both chairs, "So the question everyone at home is asking, between these two men, who would you put your money on?" The audience laughed. It was a joke. It was the kind of joke that only becomes a problem if one of the people in the chairs decides it is not a joke. Raymond Farrell looked at Chuck Norris. He looked at him for approximately 3 seconds. Then he reached forward and lifted the microphone from the small table between them. He held it at a careful distance from his mouth, the way a man holds something when he wants to make sure his voice carries. He said, "Your karate is fake. You don't belong here." There was a silence of the particular quality that a room produces when it cannot decide whether what it just heard was a joke. It lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then, it became a different kind of silence. If you want to find out what happened in the next 14 seconds, make sure you are subscribed and tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Don Hapscom set his card down on the desk. He set it down slowly with deliberate control, the way a man sets something down when he does not trust his hands. The boom operator, a 24-year-old named Pete Colucci, who had been working at NBC for 8 months, later said that he stopped moving the pole. He said he did not make a decision to stop. He simply stopped. His hands held the pole in its last position and he did not move for what he estimated was close to a minute, though the tape shows it was 11 seconds. 112 audience members did not make a sound. The floor director standing behind camera 2 took his headset off with one hand and held it at his side. Chuck Norris looked at Raymond Farrell. He did not look at him with anger. He did not look at him with contempt. The floor director, who had a direct sightline to his face, said later that his expression was closer to the expression of a man reading a road sign in unfamiliar country. Patient, gathering information. He reached down to the arm of his chair and lifted his jacket from where he had folded it on the armrest. He refolded it once, along the original crease. He sat it on the seat of the chair beside him. He did not rush the folding. He did not perform it. He simply completed it and then stood. He stood without hurry. He straightened to his full height, which was less than Farrell's full height by 4 inches. He walked 3 steps to the center of the stage, to the open space between the 2 rows of chairs that the set designer had left clear as a visual lane for the camera. The recognition moved through the audience in the way that recognition moves through a crowd that has been sitting in the passive position of spectators, and suddenly understands that it is about to witness something that is not on the schedule. It moved from the front row backward, slowly, like a current finding the path of least resistance, through still water. A woman in the 4th row, a martial arts instructor from Torrance named Ellen Vega, said afterward that she understood what was happening before she understood why she understood it. She said, "There was something about the way he stood, not aggressive, just completely there." Raymond Farrell rose from his chair. He was 219 pounds of certified competitive accomplishment, and he stood on a television stage in front of 112 witnesses and a running camera, and he looked at Chuck Norris standing in the center of that stage, smaller, older, in hardware store shoes, and he began to walk forward. He has already lost. He simply does not know it yet. What happened next lasted 14 seconds. 14 seconds in front of 112 trained observers, and a camera that was still running because the cameraman, a veteran named Earl Desmond who had covered 3 network sporting events, did not lower it. 14 seconds in a television studio under 5,600 Kelvin lights is a different kind of 14 seconds than 14 seconds anywhere else. It arrives at a different speed, it leaves a different mark. Second 1. Ferrell closed to 7 feet and stopped. He settled his weight, his stance was clean. His hands came up in the guard position that 3 consecutive All-American titles had been built on. It was technically correct. Every element of it was technically correct. The weight distribution, the shoulder angle, the lead hand position. The tournament director who reviewed the footage later said the stance alone would have earned marks in a technical display. Chuck Norris did not take a stance. He stood with his feet at shoulder width and his hands at his sides marginally open. He looked at Ferrell the way a man looks at an approach road when he is calculating the distance to the next town. Second 2. Ferrell moved. He threw his leading jab, which was his measuring tool, the punch he used the way a carpenter uses a chalk line, to establish the distance before committing to the work. It arrived at the space where Norris's chin had been approximately 1/5 of a second before Norris was no longer in that space. Norris had not blocked it, he had not parried it, he had simply moved his head 4 inches offline, and the fist passed through air, and Ferrell's arm extended to its full reach without finding anything. 4 inches. Not 12. Not 16. 4 inches, measured afterward by Earl Desmond, who had been watching through a lens and estimated it on professional instinct. The economy of that movement was its own kind of statement. Second 3. A fight is not 2 men striking each other. A fight is a negotiation about distance. Every technique in the martial vocabulary is at its foundation an argument about where bodies are allowed to be in relation to one another. The man who controls that argument controls the fight before the first real exchange is thrown. Ferrell had spent 19 years learning to win that argument inside competition distance, inside the measured geometry of a tournament floor. What he was discovering, in the 3rd second of this encounter, was that the argument was not being conducted according to the rules he had prepared for. Second 4. Ferrell committed to a second combination. Jab, cross, turning kick. The jab found air. The cross found air. The kick was a powerful, well-formed technique that would have earned a point in any sanctioned bout he had ever entered. It landed on nothing, because Norris had stepped backward at the precise moment that the rotation of Ferrell's hip committed to the power portion of the movement, and the kick completed its arc in open space, and Ferrell's foot returned to the floor, and he was standing 219 pounds of forward committed energy with nothing to push against. Ellen Vega, in the 4th row, had both hands over her mouth. She did not remember putting them there. Second 5. Don Hapscom had not moved. His card was still on the desk. His hands were flat on the surface of the desk as though he was steadying it or steadying himself and could not determine which was necessary. Second 6. Ferrell threw his best technique. It was a spinning back kick that had ended 12 competitive bouts, that had been filmed twice for instructional purposes, that Black Belt magazine had described in the subordinate clause of a caption as textbook. The rotation was complete, the chamber was tight, the extension was full, the timing was the product of 14 years of daily practice. It found nothing. Norris had stepped inside the arc of it, into the one geometry where the kick cannot arrive, and for one moment the 2 men were close enough that the distance between them could be measured in inches rather than feet. And in that moment, Norris's right hand moved in a short, tight arc from a position beside his hip, and stopped approximately 1 inch from the left side of Raymond Ferrell's jaw. 1 inch. Held. Perfectly still. Pete Colucci, the boom operator, said later, "I didn't even see him move. I saw where he started, and I saw where he stopped, and the middle was just gone." The kick had taken Ferrell's balance slightly forward. The completion of the spin brought him around to face a hand that was not moving. He understood, in the way that trained fighters understand these things before the conscious mind has completed its assessment, what would have happened if that hand had continued its arc by 1 additional inch. He stood very still. The 112 members of the audience were not breathing in any way that could be heard. Norris lowered his hand. He lowered it the way a man lowers something that has already served its purpose. He took a step backward to a distance of 4 feet. He opened his right hand, not as a weapon and not as a performance, but as a plain extension in the space between them. And then he said something. He said it quietly enough that the microphone on the moderator's desk did not capture it with clarity. The audio technicians who reviewed the tape later could resolve 4 words of the 7 or 8 that were spoken. Those 4 words were, "Already knew you could." The remaining words are not on record. Raymond Farrell heard them. He has never repeated them publicly. He has given 3 interviews in the years since this evening, and in each one he has been asked what was said to him at that moment. And in each one he has declined to answer with a consistency that suggests the words were not small. What was on record was the choice that stood in front of Raymond Farrell in the next 3 seconds. He was a man of genuine accomplishment standing on a television stage with a hand extended toward him, and a camera still running. He could take the hand. He could decline it. The room was watching. The camera was watching. The decision he made in those 3 seconds would be the one that 112 people carried out of the studio with them. He took the hand. He shook it once. He held it for a moment longer than a formal handshake requires. Then he said, clearly enough for the desk microphone to record, "I apologize. That was wrong of me." The audience exhaled in the way that audiences exhale when they have been holding something they did not know they were holding. Norris nodded once. He walked back to his chair. He picked up his jacket from the adjacent seat. He put it on. He sat down. Don Hapscomb, with the particular professionalism of a man who has covered sports and understands that the match is sometimes the show, said, "I think that's probably where we end." The tape ran for another 11 seconds before Earl Desmond lowered the camera. What happened to those 11 seconds is a matter of minor NBC administrative history. The episode of American Fighters that aired 3 weeks later ran 18 minutes and 40 seconds, which was 40 seconds shorter than the standard format. The segment between the 19-minute 43-second mark and the end of taping was not included. A production note filed by the show's executive producer explained the edit as a timing adjustment. It named no specific reason beyond that. The 112 audience members walked out of Studio 4 at NBC Burbank into a parking lot where the evening had cooled to 61 degrees. They went to their cars. They drove home to Burbank and Torrance and Van Nuys and Glendale. Some of them called people that night. Some of them waited until the following morning. By the end of the week, the story existed in 6 dojos that could be identified by name. By the end of the month, it had reached practitioners in Phoenix, Denver, and Portland. By the end of the year, a version of it had arrived in a dojo in Edinburgh, Scotland, where it was recounted by a student who had heard it from an instructor who had heard it from a tournament competitor, who had been told by someone who claimed to have been in the studio. The Edinburgh version contained 3 details that the original event did not. It placed the encounter on a different stage. It attributed a different final technique to Norris. And it credited Farrell with throwing one more combination than he actually threw. The story had begun its transformation into the thing that stories become when they travel through years and geography without documentation. This is what oral history does. It keeps the shape of what happened while it slowly renegotiates the details. The shape of this story across every version told in every dojo across 4 decades remained consistent. A man of genuine accomplishments said something he should not have said to a man he had not accurately assessed. And the consequences arrived quietly, inside 14 seconds, in front of enough witnesses to ensure that the consequences would be remembered. Raymond Farrell continued to teach and compete. He won 1 additional major title in 1981 and retired from active competition in 1983. He opened a school in Pasadena that operated for 22 years. His students, by one estimate compiled in a martial arts journal in 1997, numbered over 800. He did not discuss the NBC evening in his school. Former students who were interviewed for that journal report that he mentioned Chuck Norris only once, in response to a direct question from a student during a seminar in 1991. He said, "He is the most patient man I have ever stood in front of. I do not use the word patient lightly." Chuck Norris did not mention the evening publicly for 11 years. In 1990, in an interview with Inside Karate magazine, he was asked about memorable experiences from his television appearances in the 1970s. He said one evening had stayed with him. He did not name the show. He did not name the other man. He said, "Sometimes the most instructive thing a man can learn is what happens when his estimate of another person has been built entirely from information that person did not supply." Ellen Vega, the instructor from Torrance who had been in the fourth row with her hands over her mouth, taught at her own school for 31 years. She told the story of that evening once a year, every year, to every new cohort of intermediate students. She told it at the moment in their training when they first began to confuse confidence with accuracy. She ended it the same way every year. She said, when the hand was extended and the apology was given, the room let go. That is the part that matters, not the technique. The hand. There is a lesson that lives inside the 14 seconds on that stage, and it is not a lesson about fighting. It is a lesson about the specific distance between what a man believes he knows and what is actually true. Farrell knew his record. He knew his titles. He knew the accumulated evidence of 19 years of disciplined practice. What he did not know, and what the evening required him to learn, was the difference between a record and a reckoning. The record is what has been written. The reckoning is what happens when two things that cannot both be true occupy the same space at the same time. The man who extends his hand after the reckoning is not the weaker man. He is the man who has decided that the lesson was worth more than the position. Farrell chose the lesson. He shook the hand. He said the words. In a studio in Burbank, under lights calibrated to make skin look alive, that choice was the most accomplished thing Raymond Farrell did that evening. Next week, we will talk about the night Steven Seagal walked into a room full of Navy SEALs and made a single claim that nobody in that room was willing to let pass without a response. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and if you have been here since the beginning, you know what the next 12 minutes cost that claim.